The engine softly hummed, filling the cabin as passengers settled comfortably into their seats. Michael Carter adjusted his polo shirt sleeves, letting out a slow breath as he observed the organized bustle of pre-flight activity around him. Flight attendants moved with purpose, helping passengers stow their bags, ushering latecomers to their seats, and ensuring everything was set for departure. For most aboard, it was just another flight. But for Michael, it represented something more, a unique opportunity. As the CEO of SkyWest Airlines, he had built his airline from the ground up. Years of dedication had gone into refining the airline's operations, focusing on efficiency, comfort, and safety. Yet today, he wasn't flying as the head of the company. He was just another first-class passenger. Every so often, he enjoyed flying under the radar, experiencing the service firsthand and reconnecting with the essence of his business. Suddenly, a shadow loomed beside him. "Excuse me, sir." A firm voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael turned to find a flight attendant standing next to him. She appeared to be in her late 30s, her demeanor professional and slightly stern. The name tag on her uniform read, "Jessica Simmons." He offered a polite smile. "Yes?" Jessica paused for a brief moment, her gaze scanning him with a hint of suspicion. "I need to verify your boarding pass." Michael blinked, surprised. That was unusual. He had already scanned his ticket at the gate, and first-class passengers typically weren't asked for verification once settled. Nevertheless, he reached into his pocket and handed over the small slip of paper. Jessica took it, glancing at the seat number, then studying him again. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Carter, are you sure this is your assigned seat?" Michael raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's what the ticket says, doesn't it?" Jessica's expression remained unyielding as she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment while we confirm something." A few nearby passengers looked up, sensing the growing tension. Michael kept his composure, but he could feel the heaviness of the moment. "Confirm what exactly?" he replied, his tone even. Jessica hesitated again, seeming to search for the right words. "I just need to verify that everything is in order. If you could come with me to the front of the plane, please." Michael's jaw tightened. He knew precisely what this was about. He had witnessed it happen to others before, but never to himself. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've shown you my ticket. I'm in the correct seat. What's the issue?" Jessica shifted awkwardly, casting around for support. A younger flight attendant named Rachel approached, with caution. "Jessica," she said gently. "What's happening?" Jessica barely acknowledged her presence. "Sir, if you do not comply, I will have to contact security." The noise level in the cabin increased, and heads began to turn. A man seated in the adjacent row whispered to his companion. A couple in front of Michael exchanged worried looks. He took a deep breath, realizing he had two options: escalate the situation or acquiesce. Familiar with power dynamics, he understood that resisting would likely exacerbate the circumstances. "Very well," he said, rising from his seat. "Lead the way." Jessica guided him toward the front of the aircraft. He could sense the gaze of the other passengers upon him, their curiosity intertwined with speculation. Upon exiting the plane and entering the jet bridge, a uniformed airport security officer was already present. Officer Blake, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, crossed his arms as Michael approached. "What seems to be the problem?" Blake inquired. Before Michael could respond, Jessica interjected, "I just need to verify that this gentleman is authorized to be in first class." Blake scrutinized Michael from head to toe. "Sir, may I see your identification?" Michael felt a wave of humiliation wash over him, but maintained a composed expression. He retrieved his wallet, extracted his driver's license, and handed it to Blake, who examined it before looking back at Jessica. His ticket was indeed valid. Jessica hesitated. "Yes, but what?" Blake interrupted her. Jessica stumbled over her words. I had concerns." Michael's patience was wearing thin. He turned to Jessica, his tone steady yet laced with firmness. "What specifically about me raised your concerns?" Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but then fell silent. She averted her gaze, as if suddenly aware of how the situation appeared. Blake sighed, shaking his head. "Mr. Carter, you are permitted to reboard." Michael let out a brief, humorless laugh. "No, I believe I will pass." Jessica's attention snapped back to him. "Sir, we—" Michael raised a hand to silence her. "No, you have already formed your judgments about me. Now you must face the repercussions." At that moment, a voice called out from the terminal behind them. "Michael!" Richard Lawson, a senior executive at SkyWest Airlines, approached, his expression a blend of confusion and concern. "What on earth is happening here?" Jessica turned to Richard, her face paling. You know him." Richard's expression darkened as he regarded her. "Know him?" "Jessica, this is Michael Carter, the CEO of this airline." Silence enveloped them, a heavy and profound silence. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Michael, truly looked at him, and for the first time the gravity of her error became clear. Michael remained silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "If I were not who I am," he said softly, "how would this situation have unfolded?" Jessica felt her stomach knot. She had no response. The ensuing moments passed in a blur. The other flight attendants murmured among themselves. The security officer stepped back, visibly uneasy. Richard rubbed his temple, already bracing for the potential public relations fallout. Jessica swallowed hard. "Mr. Carter, I was merely attempting to—" Michael raised a hand, effectively silencing her. His tone remained composed, yet there was an unmistakable chill in his voice. "What, precisely, were you attempting to do?" Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again. She recognized that any words she could offer would merely serve as an excuse. Richard turned his attention to Michael. "Michael, let us return you to the plane. We can—" Michael interrupted with a shake of his head. "No, I will not be flying today." Jessica felt her stomach sink further. She understood the implications of his refusal to board. It would lead to inquiries and repercussions. Michael's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time Jessica felt utterly vulnerable. This was not solely about this singular error. It encompassed all her previous missteps. "I expect you in my office," he stated plainly. He then turned and departed. Jessica remained motionless, shame coursing through her. The burden of her choices weighed heavily upon her, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time in her professional life, she comprehended that this situation transcended a mere mistake. It was about the person she had allowed herself to become. Jessica Simmons sat in the break room of the SkyWest headquarters, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned pale. The room was devoid of any presence except for her and the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall, each second elongating into what felt like an eternity. She had scarcely slept the previous night, the gravity of her actions replaying in her mind, the icy glare Michael Carter had directed at her, the way Richard Lawson's complexion had drained when he grasped the situation, the whispers of the passengers as she escorted Michael away from his own aircraft. She had brought humiliation upon the CEO of the airline. More significantly, she had brought humiliation upon herself. The door swung open abruptly, causing Jessica to sit up straight. Richard Lawson entered first, his face a mask of neutrality. He stepped aside as Michael Carter followed, an air of authority surrounding him effortlessly. Gone was the laid-back polo shirt of the previous day. Today he donned a sharp, dark navy suit, polished and formidable. The Michael Carter in front of her was not just an observer in first class, he was the CEO, and his judgment loomed large. "Jessica," Richard's voice was rigid. "Have a seat." Jessica suddenly realized she had been standing and quickly sank into the chair. Michael remained on his feet, his piercing gaze locked onto her. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked, his voice steady yet chilling. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. "I made a mistake." Michael tilted his head slightly, intrigued. "A mistake?" Jessica hesitated, sensing the snare in his words. A serious mistake, she amended. I misjudged the situation. I should have handled things differently. Michael showed no visible reaction. He merely slid a file across the table and opened it. Jessica's stomach churned as she saw the first page. This wasn't just a report on yesterday's events. It was another report from 5 years prior. A distinct flight, a different passenger. Yet, the same glaring error. Her throat went dry. You've done this before, Michael stated matter-of-factly. Jessica shot a desperate glance at Richard, but his expression remained stoic. He wasn't here to come to her aid. Michael tapped the file. Tell me, Jessica, what was your concern in this case? That a first-class passenger didn't appear to belong? That they didn't fit your notion of who should occupy that space? Jessica's breath became shallow and unsteady. I never meant to discriminate. Finally, Michael took a seat across from her, intertwining his fingers. Then what was your intention? Jessica opened her mouth but hesitated. What could she say? I was trying to be careful, she replied faintly. Careful? Michael echoed. You were diligent enough to escalate the situation before verifying basic information. Diligent enough to call security on your own CEO, and evidently diligent enough to repeat this mistake. Jessica's heart raced. She had hoped yesterday's incident would be the end of the discussion. She hadn't realized Michael had investigated further. I don't remember much about that case, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, allow me to refresh your memory, Michael said, flipping to the next page in the file. The passenger was a black man in his late 20s. He held a business-class ticket. You flagged him for a random seat verification after he had already boarded. When he objected, you had security escort him off the plane. The airline settled the complaint out of court following his grievance. Jessica shut her eyes for a moment, pushing that incident deep down into her memory. Richard Lawson stepped in first, his expression composed. He moved aside to let Michael Carter enter, exuding an effortless authority. Yesterday's casual polo shirt was replaced with a sharp, dark navy suit that commanded respect. The man before her was no mere observer. He embodied the weight of the CEO, his judgment hanging heavily in the air. Jessica, Richard's voice was firm. Please, have a seat. Suddenly aware she'd been standing too long, Jessica quickly settled into the chair. Michael remained standing, his intense gaze fixed on her. Do you know why you're here? He inquired, his tone steady yet unsettling. Jessica felt her throat constrict. I made a mistake. Michael tilted his head slightly, a hint of curiosity in his demeanor. A mistake? Hesitation crept in as Jessica sensed the trap in his words. A serious mistake, she revised. I misjudged the situation. I should have approached it differently. Michael's face was impassive, revealing no emotion. He slid a file toward her and opened it. Jessica's stomach churned at the sight of the first page. It was more than just a recap of the prior day's events. It was a report from 5 years ago. The flight was distinct, the passenger different, yet the glaring error remained the same. Her mouth went dry. You've done this before, Michael stated with certainty. In a desperate plea, Jessica glanced at Richard, but his face was a mask of neutrality. He wasn't stepping in to help her. Michael tapped the file with a pen. What was your concern in this case, Jessica? That a first-class passenger didn't seem to fit in? That he didn't match your idea of who belonged in that seat? Jessica felt her breath quicken, growing, shallow, and uneven. I never intended to discriminate. Finally, Michael took a seat across from her, his fingers intertwined. Then what was your intention? Jessica opened her mouth to respond but faltered. What could she say? I was just trying to be cautious, she murmured. Careful, Michael repeated. You went to the extent of escalating the situation before checking basic information. Diligent enough to call security on your own CEO. Clearly, diligent enough to commit this error again. Jessica's heart raced. She had hoped that the incident from the previous day would close the chapter. Little did she know Michael had dug deeper. "I don't recall much about that case," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Let me jog your memory," Michael said, flipping to the next page in the file. "The passenger was a black man in his late 20s. He held a business class ticket. You flagged him for a seat verification after he had already boarded. When he protested, you had security escort him off the plane. The airline settled the complaint out of court after his grievance." Jessica shut her eyes for a fleeting moment, burying that incident deep within her mind. Jessica Simmons sat in the conference room on the 15th floor of SkyWest headquarters, a mix of nerves and curiosity coursing through her. She found herself surrounded by individuals she had never envisioned sharing a table with. Directly across from her was Elijah Parker, a businessman in his early 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His rigid posture and unreadable expression hinted at the tension in the room. Next to him sat Lisa Rodriguez, a seasoned flight attendant, known for her relentless advocacy for diversity and inclusion in the airline sector. To Jessica's right, Mark Evans, a corporate trainer, nervously adjusted his glasses while flipping through a pile of documents, adding to the air of anticipation. At the head of the table was Michael Carter, who set the tone with a calm yet commanding presence. "Let's begin," he said, and Jessica felt her throat tighten. This was part of the deal. She had to listen before she could voice her thoughts. Michael turned his attention to Elijah. "Would you mind sharing your experience?" he asked. Elijah took a slow breath, his gaze steady. 5 years ago, I was on a flight from LA to Chicago, business class. I had just wrapped up a significant deal and was exhausted, just wanting to catch a few Z's. He continued. I settled into my seat, buckled up, and within moments, a flight attendant approached to check my boarding pass again. Jessica could feel a knot forming in her stomach. She had a sinking feeling about where this was headed. Elijah's voice stayed composed, yet there was an underlying tension. I showed her my pass. She frowned and then asked me to step aside so they could confirm my booking. I refused, telling her I had been cleared at the gate, but she wouldn't relent. Lisa nodded, understanding the familiar frustrations of the industry. Elijah's fingers drummed on the table as he recounted. I was worn out, frustrated, but most of all, embarrassed. People were watching, whispering, staring. I wasn't causing any trouble. I was just a man trying to get home, yet I felt like a criminal. Jessica imagined the scene vividly, her heart racing as she pictured herself in the flight attendant's shoes. Elijah took a deep breath before continuing. Then security was called. They asked me to leave the plane. I stood my ground, but they threatened to remove me by force. So, I ultimately walked away. Silence enveloped the room as he stared, directly at Jessica. The airline settled with me out of court, he revealed. They paid me well to keep it under wraps. No apology, no public acknowledgement. And truthfully, I never flew with that airline again. Jessica tightened her grip on the armrest, the name of the airline ringing starkly in her mind. SkyWest, and she was the flight attendant who had asked him to leave. The realization struck her hard, like a sudden blow. At first, when Michael had shown her the file, the details had been hazy. But now, as she listened to Elijah speak and noticed the tension in his jaw, memories flooded back. She remembered how she had stood firm, claiming she was just following protocol. She recalled how she had avoided his gaze as security escorted him off the aircraft. In that moment, she had justified her actions, telling herself she was merely doing her job. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Elijah Parker wasn't just another passenger. He was her responsibility, her oversight, her casualty. Michael's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Jessica, he said calmly, do you remember Elijah? Jessica swallowed hard, her throat constricted. Yes, she managed to reply. Elijah's expression shifted, a slight darkness passing over his features, Jessica felt her heart race. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she hadn't fully grasped the implications? That she never intended for any of this? None of it seemed adequate. "I was wrong," she murmured, barely audible. Elijah didn't flinch. He simply stared, waiting for more. An unfamiliar weight settled in Jessica's chest. This conversation was deeper than the surface exchange. It wasn't just an apology, it was about taking responsibility for her actions. She exhaled unsteadily. "I humiliated you. I made assumptions that were completely unfounded. She paused. "I belittled you, and I had no justification for that. I can't undo it. But I can acknowledge that I'm aware of what I did, and I loathe that it took me this long to see it." For the first time, there was a faint shift in Elijah's expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Jessica turned to Michael. "You were right. If he had been anyone else that day, things would have unfolded differently." Michael nodded slowly. A breath she didn't know she was holding escaped her. "I need to make this right. Not just for herself, for the company, for the next person who finds themselves in that seat, who doesn't fit the mold." Michael regarded her intently for a moment before leaning back in his chair. "Good," he said simply. "Now, let's ensure this doesn't happen again." Jessica had never imagined a corporate training session could reshape her perspective on life. After more than a decade as a flight attendant, she had mastered safety protocols, excelled at customer service, and learned the art of conflict de-escalation. But nothing had prepared her for the powerful stories shared in that room, particularly Elijah's stories of being trailed by airport security without cause, experiences of passengers having their seating arrangements questioned time and again, accounts of snap judgments made in an instant, based on nothing more than skin color or appearance. Now, she was forced to listen. Michael Carter had orchestrated this moment. This wasn't just another diversity seminar where attendees nodded and checked off a box. This was something far more significant, and Jessica found herself in the thick of it. "Tell me," Michael directed, standing at the front of the training room. "What's the first thing you notice about a passenger when they board?" Jessica hesitated, seated among fellow SkyWest employees, flight attendants, gate agents, and supervisors alike. "A lot of things," a younger flight attendant named David chimed in. "If they seem confused, if they're overloaded with bags, if they appear nervous." Michael nodded in acknowledgement. "And do you ever notice who they are? Not just their behavior, but what they look like?" A heavy silence fell, and Jessica's hands tightened in her lap. The truth was, she had noticed. She had been trained to remain vigilant for anything that seemed out of the ordinary. For too long, out of the ordinary had meant people who diverged from the profile of a typical first-class passenger. She had never considered herself biased, but the past few weeks had dismantled that notion. Michael turned his focus to Jessica. "You've had time to reflect. What were your thoughts that day when you saw me in first class?" Jessica felt a knot in her stomach but forced herself to respond. "I thought you didn't belong." A few heads pivoted toward her, shocked. It was the first time she had voiced that belief aloud. Michael remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "And why did you think that?" Jessica took a deep breath. "Because I made assumptions. I looked at you and questioned your presence without even realizing it. And when you challenged me, what did you do?" he prompted, maintaining eye contact. I didn't pause. "To reconsider, I stood my ground." Michael observed her for another moment before addressing everyone again. "That," he stated, "is precisely why we are here." In the weeks that followed, Jessica found herself deeply engaged in SkyWest's new bias training program, much more than she had ever anticipated. It wasn't an easy journey. She participated in focus groups with Black and Latino travelers who shared their experiences of being questioned, overlooked, or treated unfairly while flying. She listened as her colleagues admitted to moments when They'd made similar judgments but hadn't had to confront those realities. Gradually, it became hard to ignore the reflection of herself in their stories. She recognized how she'd brushed off passengers' complaints when they mentioned being mistreated. She recalled defending her actions, believing she was merely adhering to protocol. She began to understand that her cautiousness had actually been a way of upholding a system that made people feel unwelcome. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging session, Jessica found herself outside the training room, gazing at the city skyline through the glass. She heard footsteps coming toward her. "You survived," Michael remarked. Jessica offered a light, weary laugh. "Barely," she replied, as Michael crossed his arms. "It's not meant to be easy." Jessica faced him. "It's not, but it's necessary." Michael studied her for a moment before giving a nod. "So what now?" Jessica squared her shoulders. "Now I keep learning. I keep listening. And I make sure that what happened to you, and what happened with Elijah, never happens again." For the first time, Michael's demeanor softened a bit. "Good," he said. "That's all I wanted to hear." 6 months later, Jessica was at Denver International Airport, observing the familiar scene of passengers navigating security, bags rolling behind them, glancing at departure screens. Things felt different now, or perhaps she had changed. The last few months had been among the most challenging and illuminating of her career. The training sessions, the hard conversations, the awakening to her own complicity in a larger issue had reshaped her perspective. She no longer traversed airports with an automatic checklist of who belonged where. Her instinct to quickly judge was fading. She had learned to pause, to interrogate her thoughts. Most importantly, she had learned the value of listening. "Jessica!" Turning, she saw Lisa Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant who had played a key role in the bias training, approaching her quickly. "They want us in the conference room in 10 minutes, Lisa said. Michael set to make the final announcement. Jessica nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag. Michael Carter had indeed kept his promise. Following the incident on Flight 417, he had radically changed SkyWest's training approach. It was no longer solely about customer service. It was all about raising awareness, taking responsibility, and making real changes. Bias training had become a requirement for every employee, from the top executives to the baggage handlers. Flight attendants underwent training to recognize their own biases before acting on them. Today, Michael was set to unveil the final phase of this initiative, a mentorship program where experienced employees like Jessica would mentor new hires, sharing the pivotal lessons she'd learned through her own journey. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just a year ago, she would have felt least qualified to teach anyone about fairness. She was living proof that change is possible when one chooses to confront the truth. The conference room was packed as Michael took center stage, dressed in his usual sharp suit, his presence naturally commanding attention. 6 months ago, he began, I sat in a meeting just like this, questioning whether SkyWest was truly the airline I envisioned. Jessica listened intently, her heart steady. That day I realized we weren't just facing a one-off issue, Michael continued. We were confronting a culture that needed transformation. And that transformation doesn't come from policies alone. It happens when individuals choose to improve. He shot a glance in Jessica's direction. And some people have. In that moment, Jessica felt a weight settle within her. Not shame, but a newfound sense of responsibility. Michael addressed the room again. This isn't the conclusion of our efforts. It's merely the beginning. But today I can confidently say that SkyWest is on the right path. The room burst into applause. Jessica joined in, but what resonated most was a feeling of belonging she hadn't realized she craved. 6 months earlier, she had almost lost her career. Now, she was part of something meaningful. Later that evening, while walking through the terminal toward her gate, she spotted a familiar face at the check-in counter. Elijah Parker. He was in line, checking his phone, first-class boarding pass in hand. Jessica hesitated for just a moment before approaching him. Mr. Parker, she said. Elijah turned, his expression initially unreadable. Then he recognized her. Taking a deep breath, Jessica spoke. "I know an apology can't change what happened, but my actions that day made you feel unwelcome, and that was wrong." Elijah regarded her for a long moment. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "People don't typically own up to these things." "I respect that," Jessica breathed out, feeling a small weight lift from her. "Safe travels," she said, stepping back. Elijah acknowledged her with a nod. "You too." As Jessica walked away, her eyes landed on Michael Carter by the gates. He was boarding a flight, dressed in casual attire, undoubtedly blending into first class like he had done before, but this time she didn't question his presence. She already had the answer. Stepping onto her own flight, Jessica felt a shift. Within her, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something fresh. And this time, she was prepared.